Rick James appeared on the scene in a blaze of glory, showing up with a head full of braids, glitter, and a lot of attitude. Rick introduced the world to his fusion of R&B, funk, and rock. He was an instant smash as his first single went #1. However, before he was the author of Punk Funk, Rick had been many things before that. The son of a numbers runner, a juvenile delinquent, a military man, a fugitive wanted by the FBI, a drug pusher, a concert promoter. The list goes on. After 25 top 10 singles, as well as 6 gold or platinum albums, there's one thing that everybody had to agree that he was as well. One of the greatest and one of the most popular recording artists of all time. James Ambrose Johnson Jr. was born February the 1st, 1948 in Buffalo, New York to James Sr. and Mabel. Rick was raised in a family of 8, 4 boys and 4 girls. Rick was third in that head count. His mother had her first child when she was only 13, and her 2 oldest children had different fathers than Rick did. Eventually, Rick would barely remember his father, and most of what he did remember wasn't good. He and Rick's mom fought all the time, and he physically abused Mabel. When this happened, young Rick often dreamed of being a grown man so that he could end his father for what he was doing to his mother. One of Rick's best memories as a child was the day his father walked out on the family and never came back. Rick's mother had 2 cleaning jobs. This was because she thought it would look good if the cops ever suspected her of anything. Secretly, she was running numbers for the Italian mob. She raised the children as Catholics, and Rick even became an altar boy. However, in typical Rick James form, he was drinking wine from the tabernacle. During confession, he admitted to doing that, and along with admitting to some impure thoughts about nuns, he got kicked out of Catholic school. And Rick was already wild as a boy, claiming that he lost his virginity when he was only 9 years old. Due to YouTube's guidelines, we'll just leave it at that. Rick loved to listen to his mom's record collection. He enjoyed Billy Eckstine, Billie Holiday, Dakota Staton, and Sarah Vaughan. His mother encouraged his interest in music, and occasionally when she made numbers runs, she'd take him along with her. That was how Rick got to see Etta James performing, and his mother also sneaked him into some other clubs to see Miles Davis, Wes Montgomery, and the Moonglows. At one point, Rick's mother brought him and his brother a bike that they shared, and she warned them to not go off individually on the bike, but stay together and watch out for each other. And they did that. However, one day Rick decided that he'd rather spend time with a girl than ride the bike with Roy. That same day, Roy got hit by an ice cream truck that also dragged him under the wheels for several blocks. As a result, Roy spent 2 years in a cast that covered both his legs and up to his waist. This devastated his mother. When she asked Rick why he wasn't with Roy, he lied and said he was too tired to ride the bike. Now, having to serve as Roy's nurse, Rick's mom had even more added to her already full plate. This meant that Rick not only lost his running buddy in Roy, he also now rarely saw his mother, and this often left Rick feeling lonely. He began to feel like his mother was blaming him for what happened to Roy, since Rick hadn't been there like his mother had told him to be. At the same time, Rick was resenting Roy for leaving him alone, and Rick began feeling neglected, and he started skipping school. Sometimes he'd steal money out of his mother's purse and take a 12-hour bus ride to New York City to just walk around, hang out. Sometimes he would sneak into clubs and see acts like John Coltrane, Chubby Checker, and Jackie Wilson. After he ran out of money, he called his mother, who sent him money to come back home. Once he got there, that's when Wimble was waiting for him. A little later, Rick started a singing group that began doubling as a gang. When Rick was 13, after a boy got hit by gunfire during one of the gang fights, Rick got arrested and put in a juvenile home for a few months. However, once it was obvious that the boy would survive his wounds, the judge dropped the charges. When Rick got home, his mom was waiting for him, ass-whipping utensil in hand. Rick was done with taking beatings, though. When she tried to attack, he just caught and held the cord, not hitting her, but also not letting her hit him. This made his mom cry, but Rick was determined not to be beaten again. Later, Rick would get kicked out of high school for missing school too many times. After he got kicked out yet another school, he stopped going to school altogether. This was during the time when the Vietnam War was going on, and since Rick wasn't in school, he was eligible to be drafted any day. Around this time, Rick met Malcolm Ernie, a minister. Ernie was a learned man, knowledgeable about politics and black culture as it related to Africa. He and Rick began to talk to each other, and eventually they started walking and talking together for hours at a time about the Bible and about black people. One day, Malcolm told Rick that he was opening an African culture center to help black people learn the truth about black history. Rick began playing conga drums for the center, and as a group, they began doing concerts for the community. But after a while, Rick drifted away from being at the center. His mindset just didn't blend with the nonviolent stance that the center preached. When Rick initially began spending so much time at the center, he lost track of what his old friends were up to. When he went back to see what they were doing, things had drastically changed. His friend Danny, who previously wanted nothing to do with drugs, was now strung out on H. His other friends, Moses and Truly, had also become H addicts, and Rick too soon found himself in the same situation. This led he and his friends to resort to breaking and entering to support their habits. Soon enough, he got busted for burglary. When his mother, along with Malcolm, came to bail him out, Rick admitted to Malcolm that he was an H addict. However, he asked Malcolm not to tell his mother. The two of them devised a plan to have Rick go cold turkey. He went to stay with his Aunt Luella in the boogie down Bronx. She agreed to help him, while also agreeing that she wouldn't tell Rick's mom. Going cold turkey sounded good, but it wasn't easy for Rick. He later reflected that it was the worst he ever felt in his entire life. After he recovered, he went back to Buffalo, and he found out that he was getting closer to being drafted. He also found out that his friend Danny was now looking at 6 to 10 years for robbery. Trying to avoid the fate of his friend, while also avoiding getting drafted, Rick took advice from Malcolm and joined the Naval Reserve. Doing that allowed him to stay home, avoid Vietnam, and also get paid. At only 15, he lied and told the Navy that he was really 18. His new obligation had him reporting for duty twice a month. When he initially reported, he had his stripes sewn upside down on his uniform. That was a precursor to how his brief and convoluted Navy career would go. Rick soon ignored his military obligations and missed numerous months of mandatory attendance. As punishment, he got a letter telling him to report to active duty for 45 days. When he arrived, he was given the full basic training treatment. He was shaved bald while also having to shave off all his facial hair. He learned to march, shine boots, fire and disassemble weapons, and about water survival. Not long after this, Rick's number finally was up. In 1964, when he was 16, he received notification that he'd been drafted and was headed to Vietnam. While he was waiting in Rochester, New York to get shipped overseas, Rick decided to take a detour. He went AWOL, or absent without leave, leaving America and going to Canada. As he got there, some white Americans began hassling him, intent on beating him up. At the same time, 3 other white dudes saw what was happening, and one of them punched the main instigator in the face, which made his other buddies run away. The man who did the punching, Pat, befriended Rick and took him to a few coffee houses. At one of them, Pat discovered that Rick could sing and arranged for him to get up on stage. Rick impressed the crowd with a couple of songs. Afterwards, Rick met a man named Nick, who was a member of the band. He gave Rick his number and told him to give him a call. Afterwards, Pat took Rick back to his place, where Rick met Pat's girlfriend, Shirley. After finding out that Rick was AWOL, Shirley suggested a new name to help him avoid the authorities. Using her dead cousin's name, she told James Ambrose Johnson Jr. that his new name was Ricky James Matthews. Of course, later he would shorten it to simply Rick James. Later that day, Rick called Nick, who asked him to join his band. Meanwhile, the band, playing off Rick's Navy background, changed their name to the Sailor Boys. They even began wearing Rick's Navy gear on stage. Rick was around other artists who were struggling at the time, but would later become famous. People such as Gordon Lightfoot, Joni Mitchell, Kenny Rogers, and Neil Young. After about 2 years in Toronto, Rick was doing all right. He communicated with his mom by letter because she told him the FBI was looking for him. She believed that they could be tapping her phone. Meanwhile, Rick and Nick had a falling out and Nick left the band. The group then began doing a mix of funk, jazz, rock, and top 40. Later, after changing their name to the Minor Birds, the group was still together but didn't have any steady gigs. In 1967, Neil Young joined Rick's band. Even though Rick thought he was a terrible singer, he was impressed with his songwriting. One day, Marley Shellman, a friend of Rick's, told him he wanted to manage Rick's group, and he promised that he could get them a record deal, as well as financial backing from John Craig Eaton, who was a rich man. Eaton brought the band all new equipment and let them rehearse in his mansion. Meanwhile, Shellman had taken the tape of the group to Motown, who liked what they heard. The label wanted to cash in on the English movement as well as rock music and saw Rick's group as a way to do that. At that point, Rick was forced to tell Shellman that he was AWOL from the military. To avoid the authorities, Rick crossed the border by car, and once he got to Detroit, he and the group laid down 10 tracks. Afterwards, they got to meet Marvin Gaye, the Isley Brothers, and the Temptations. The funny thing was, all these groups looked at Rick and his crew strangely and asked them, "Hey man, where y'all get them clothes from?" The style of Detroit at that time was processed hair, iridescent pants, mohair, and sharkskin suits, baby. Conversely, Rick had shoulder-length hair, he wore dark round glasses like John Lennon be wearing, along with a mod jacket and corduroy bell-bottoms with sandals. After getting back to Toronto, Rick began asking Shellman, "Hey man, where the money at that Motown said was coming?" He never got a real answer, and he kept getting the runaround. After one phone call about the money, Shellman told Rick to come out to his new house. News of a new house was a surprise to Rick. He got another surprise when he got to the house and saw that Shellman had also gotten himself a new motorcycle. These shiny new purchases led Rick to believe that Shellman had used the group's money to get these things for himself. Shellman told Rick that the money would be here. "Hey man, it's going to be here next week." But Rick wanted his money now. Since Shellman didn't have it, Rick beat him down. Afterwards, Shellman was no longer the group's manager, but that also meant that he was taking Eaton, the group's benefactor, with him. Shellman also had another move up his sleeve that Rick would soon find out about. When Rick called Motown, the label told him that they were holding off on the release of the group's single. Why? Because of Rick's being AWOL and his unresolved military obligations with the Navy. Man, Rick cried when he heard this, for 3 reasons. First, he knew that there was only one way Motown could have found out about his being AWOL. Shellman had betrayed him by telling Motown about his situation. Next, Rick now couldn't be signed by any major American record label, as the FBI had blanketed them all with news of his fugitive status. Third, he was now resigned to the fact that he had to turn himself in and stop running from the FBI. As a result, Rick went back to Buffalo, went home, and had the FBI pick him up there. All this, and he was still only 19 years old. In handcuffs, the authorities took him to the Brooklyn Naval Brig, which was a lockdown facility. After about 7 months there, his day in court came. He could have been charged with desertion, which would have meant life in prison. However, since he had turned himself in, he was only charged with being AWOL. In spite of that, he was still in the brig. Meanwhile, one day he was looking at a magazine and he saw pictures of Neil Young, as well as some of his other buddies from the Toronto village. Man, seeing how well his old bandmates were doing while he was hemmed up in the brig, that made him more determined than ever to get out of there. After conspiring to escape with 2 other men, Rick walked out of the front gates of the naval base, walked a block, then hailed a taxi. He was a fugitive again, but he was free again too. Afterwards, he flew to Toronto. Once he heard that the Canadian police had been warned he might be there, he moved on to Montreal. While he was hanging out and writing songs over the next few months, Rick was in contact with his mom. It turns out that he had a cousin, Louis Stokes, who was a congressman in Ohio. She told Rick that Stokes had written a special letter on his behalf and that the Navy wanted him out of the service as much as he wanted to get out of it. The Navy was offering that Rick do a couple of years of jail time, then get out of the Navy with a dishonorable discharge. He thought that sounded good, so he decided to turn himself in for a second time. Ultimately, he received a general discharge, and additionally, since he was underage when he joined the Navy, he only served about 6 months in the brig. Afterwards, he was finally legitimately free. He headed back to Buffalo, but things there now seemed too small, too slow for him. After a year, he moved on with pit stops in Toronto and Miami. Eventually, he made it out to California. Now, don't forget we said he made a pit stop in Toronto. That's going to come up again shortly. Once he got to California, he hooked up with some of his old friends who introduced him to Stephen Sills. Rick began to hang out with him, and at one point he stayed with him for about a week. During that time, one night Rick was crashing on the floor, and he felt funny. Somebody was looking at him. When he jumped up, he was introduced to Jim Morrison, who at the time was still unknown and was the lead singer of the group The Doors. In the crazy scene, Morrison was sitting in the lotus position. Meanwhile, blood was spurting from his wrist, while Morrison was looking at it and saying, "Wow, isn't that beautiful?" Oh boy. Rick jumped up and woke Sills up, and together they bandaged Jim's wound. Not long after this, Rick would find himself in another strange situation, again courtesy of Morrison. While at the Whiskey A Go-Go, Rick and Jim sat upstairs waiting for Buffalo Springfield to perform. After enjoying some weed, Morrison asked James if he wanted some mint. Rick said yes. Jim smiled, told him to open his mouth, and threw a little blue mint into it. Soon, Rick started feeling strange, and everything all of a sudden was bright, and everything started being funny too. His fingers went numb, and he was all by himself in the balcony, but he was so messed up, he didn't know how to get downstairs. What Morrison had given him wasn't a mint at all. Instead, it was something that rhymed with Bassett. Rick was angry at Morrison, but hey, he wasn't mad at how that Bassett made him feel. He was hooked. Rick's next move would come with unexpected circumstances. He met a dude that was willing to back a band of Rick's choosing, and he told Rick to go to Toronto, get the band members he wanted, and then bring them back. Rick was excited, and he went to Toronto. While he was at a club checking out a band, 2 cops grabbed him and threw him into a squad car. Then they started questioning him about a clothing store robbery in Toronto. Rick told them that he didn't know anything about what they was talking about, but that was a lie. Remember the little bit ago we told you to remember we said he had a pit stop in Toronto? This is what he did during that pit stop. While he was there, he ran out of dope. However, his dealer came up with a compromise. If Rick would break into a boutique store, steal some clothes, Rick would get a free re-up. As a result, Rick broke in, stole plenty of items for the dealer. He also got some premium items for himself too. However, Rick casually left fingerprints all over the store, so the cops had been looking for him for a while. Once the cops knew he was back in Toronto, they went to his hotel room and found some of the items that he had stolen from the store. They still had the store's price tags on them. As a result, Rick got charged with breaking and entering, as well as possession of stolen goods. Since Rick was from the United States, he was remanded with an immigration hold. This meant that he couldn't make bail, so he stayed in jail for 9 months, then was finally released, deported, and dropped off at the border. Too embarrassed to reconnect with his friends in California, Rick went back to his mother's house. After struggling to figure out what to do with himself, his mother suggested he call Motown to see what they had to offer. And he did that, and surprisingly, the label sent him a ticket to come to Detroit. At that point, Rick had no interest in being a recording artist. He felt that there were far too many great singers to compete with, but he found that Motown was willing to help him develop his talent as a producer, and he got to learn from the best as Norma Whitfield took a liking to him. He also became friends with Jimmy Ruffin, who was the older brother of Temptation's lead singer David Ruffin. At the time, Rick was dating a girl who was roommates with another girl. Ruffin, who was married, was messing around with the other roommate. Soon, Ruffin approached Rick with a plan. "Hey man, why don't we pimp these 2 girls out?" James agreed, and the 2 of them started doing just that. Eventually, Rick had a handful of women working for him. However, his conscience started bothering him, and he didn't like what he was doing. Besides, he had bigger plans for his life, and he stopped pimping. He also stopped hanging around Ruffin. Meanwhile, Rick was given his first assignment as a producer, work with the new group Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers. In the band was a guitar player named Tommy Chong, who would later find fame as half of the comedy duo Cheech and Chong. For them, Rick wrote and produced the song Out in the Country. After this, in confidence, Norman Whitfield told him, quote unquote, "Rick, you might as well try to do your thing somewhere else." Whitfield went on to tell him that there were too many obstacles in his way at Motown. Furthermore, all he'd ever be there was a tax write-off, suffering through the political BS that existed at the label. Rick listened to him and decided to head back to California. Meanwhile, Rick began hanging out with a street dude that Rick later described as a serious player. He had his hands in both the counterfeit money game as well as the drug game. One day, Ron was going to be away for about 3 weeks, and he asked Rick to hold some product for him. Specifically, he gave him some cocaine, which he told Rick not to use. Additionally, he gave him some H to hold for him. Not only did Rick use some of the cocaine, he also sold a lot of the H to his friends to generate some much-needed cash for himself. When the dude got back and asked for his product, he didn't mention the fact that any was missing. He just picked up the stuff and left. Rick thought that meant everything was cool between them. Meanwhile, there was a shortage of weed in Los Angeles, and people didn't know where to get none. A friend of Rick's was looking for a lot of it. Hearing that, Rick knew what he had to do. Believe it or not, Rick actually had the gall to call Ron and ask him for the hookup. He said he could get it, and the meet was set. At the meet, Rick got a chance to sample the product, and it was good, so the deal was completed. Once Rick got the product back home, though, he found something was wrong. When he opened the packages, listen, half of them were filled with grass clippings from a lawnmower. That wasn't the grass that Rick was looking for, and it definitely wasn't what he paid for. In Rick's next would-be adventure, his overindulgence in partying would save his life. One day, his friend Jay Sebring came by Rick's place, and he told Rick and his girl about a party that they just couldn't miss. However, the night before, Rick had gotten real messed up, and as a result, when Jay came by, Rick had a hangover and he was still trying to recover. He told Jay, "Listen, hey man, go on ahead, just leave the address. I'll catch up with you later on." Jay left the address and he went to the party alone. Rick fell asleep, and then he woke up and he had every intention of going to his party, and this girl was hyping him up. She really wanted to go. "Let's get to this party. You heard what Jay said." But then that headache kicked in again. Rick wasn't feeling no party. And so he just couldn't go. He went ahead and laid down and he just chilled. Now, a few days later, Rick saw a newspaper, and in the newspaper, he read that Jay had lost his life along with Sharon Tate and others in what would later become known as acts committed by followers of Charles Manson. While Rick mourned the loss of his friend, he also considered the fact that he was supposed to be there too. Sometime later, Rick formed the group White Cane. The group was signed to MGM and recorded an album. As Rick later reflected, he let somebody else have complete control of the album. Rick himself was left out of the mixing and at one point was barred from the studio. The album was a flop, and it did absolutely nothing. Rick's next 2 moves would seem to be good ideas until they weren't. First, after White Cane's failure, the group disbanded, and wanting to go back where he had the most success musically, Rick and his current girlfriend Kelly moved to Toronto. Once he got there, his first move was a straight-up scam. He'd have his girl dress up in a sexy outfit, then she'd go to a bank with the idea that how she looked would be the key that would unlock any bank vault. Once she got to see a loan officer, the combination of a pretty face and a sob story did its work. Kelly would tell them that her mom died or her dad had cancer or some such. Next, she'd tell them that she just started a job that was making good money, but she wouldn't be getting paid for a while. Then, to seal the deal, she'd have them call her boss to verify her employment information. Answering the phone on the other end was none other than Rick, in his whitest voice, verifying that Kelly not only made lots of money, and she was the greatest employee ever. It always worked, and after repeating it several times, Rick and Kelly had enough money for an apartment and a car. They got greedy though, and kept pulling the scam until Kelly eventually got caught. Even though she avoided jail time, the law told her she had to repay all those loans. Rick's next move took him overseas to India. To avoid running afoul of YouTube's guidelines, we'll keep the description of what he did over there simple and short. He went to India to get cheap dope to bring back to the States to sell. As a bonus, by skipping town, they could avoid Kelly having to pay back those fraudulent loans. When they came back to the States with the product, they went to New York intending to get rid of their overseas purchases. However, they were stunned when they found out that Governor Rockefeller had recently passed stringent anti-drug laws. As a result, anything more than an ounce of cocaine was enough to get you life in prison. Oh no, petrified, Rick had to get rid of all his stash real fast, and he basically wound up taking half of what he initially expected to get. His next lick would at least prove to be legal. At the time, Kool and the Gang had a hit song, Funky Stuff, that was getting played everywhere. At the same time, the Ohio Players were hot with their song, Ecstasy. Rick had a brainstorm. As a promoter, he thought that he could get both of those groups to do a show together for a reasonable price. And he was right. He was also right as the event was a smash. Rick took his profits, bought himself a brand new Mercedes, and drove with his girl Kelly back to Los Angeles. For the next 6 months, they lost their minds. The two of them partied every day. One night, though, Rick got so messed up that he totaled his brand new Mercedes. At the beginning of 1974, though, Rick was back in the familiar place. He was broke. After Kelly left to stay with her family, he was able to cut a couple of tracks, My Mama and Funkin' Around, which he began to shop to various labels. A&M Records bit as they liked My Mama. While the song failed to hit stateside, in Europe the single was hot. Wanting to capitalize on this, Rick put together a band and he flew to Europe. He was able to get a promoter to get a tour together for the group as well. And they were doing good until they got to Stockholm, Sweden. Once he got there, he loved everything about that country. He loved it even more after he hooked up with the 19-year-old blonde. His love for it grew by leaps and bounds when her mother started joining them in bed. After nearly a year in Europe, Rick was ready to go back to America. To quote Rick, even the freakiest scene can lose his heat. Besides, he was missing his old girlfriend Kelly, and he also wanted to see his mom. After leaving Sweden, he hooked back up with Kelly, and the two of them decided to get married. It didn't last long though. They started fighting so much that he moved out of their apartment and moved in with a cocaine dealer. The dealer's best client was none other than George Clinton. Yes, that George Clinton. Rick wanted to meet him, so the dealer told him to take George's product the next time he was in Toronto. Sure enough, after he dropped the stuff off, George invited him to partake. And you know Rick wasn't going to turn down no free stuff. Took him up on it. Then they started talking, and Rick was running down his music history. After playing some of his stuff on the piano, George was impressed. He told Rick that he should have a major label behind him, and he also promised to help Rick get that done. Before he left town, Clinton hadn't done anything for Rick yet. However, he did leave a few numbers where he could be reached. Over the next few months, no one ever answered at any of those numbers that George gave him. Clinton never did help Rick, and James swore that he'd one day pay George back. Getting nowhere with his music, Rick decided to try being a dealer again. He was making good money at it, but decided he could make even more if he could deal directly with the source. As a result, he and his partner Myron flew over to Colombia to try and do just that. After nearly 2 months in country, a bar owner introduced him to the Connect, who sold Rick what he wanted. Afterwards, while Myron flew back to Toronto to sell the product, Rick went to visit his mother. He stayed there for a few weeks, but he never heard from Myron. When he called him, dude never answered the phone. Hey man, listen, as a result, Rick flew to Toronto to find out what was up. Once he got there, he heard through the grapevine that Myron had bought himself a new house and a new Rolls Royce. After not finding him for a while, Rick had to bribe somebody to get this dude's address. Once he got there, he hid in the bushes until Myron came out to take his trash out. He then jumped on him and demanded his money. After initially lying, saying that customs had seized the product, Myron led Rick into the house. Once he got there, he opened the safe and gave Rick $15,000 plus a pound of product. He claimed it was all he had. But Rick wasn't fooled, and he demanded another $60,000, which Myron gave him a little later. To celebrate, Rick took Kelly over to Colombia for a second honeymoon. And Since he was so close, he went ahead and purchased some more product too. When it was time to head home, the problem was he didn't have enough room to put all that product anywhere else. He was dressed in a jacket and tie for his flight, so he put the product in the Windsor knot of his tie. In his mind, he was dressed like a college nerd, so there was no way customs would ever think of searching him, until they did decide to search him. Customs officials had him stripped and patted all his pockets and linings of his clothes for contraband. They even cut the linings out looking for stuff. Rick had carefully removed and placed his towel on the floor and was thankful when the officials kept stepping around it. Eventually, they let him get dressed. However, just as Rick was getting ready to leave, one official said, "Hey, wait a second, let me look at that tie." But instead of making Rick take it off, the official only felt the tie's lining and stopped short of the knot. When Rick got the all-clear signal, he silently thanked Jesus. We're going to take a time out from our story to ask you to like, subscribe, share it, comment, hit that notification bell, and repeat when it comes to our videos. Now back to our story. While the close call with customs would have been a wake-up call for most people, for Rick it made him feel invincible and that he could get away with whatever he wanted to do. One morning, after a wild all-nighter with a couple of freak flag-flying women, Rick made it home. When he got there, Kelly was gone. 2 days later, she called to tell him that she was leaving him for her ex. "I'm sorry, baby," was all that Rick could muster. This sent Rick into a depression tailspin, and nothing helped. If he tried to hook up with a girl, she'd get angry when he couldn't rise to the occasion. Eventually, he purchased a weapon, determined to take his own life, but he was too scared to do it. Afterwards, he headed back to Buffalo to spend some time with his mom. It did the trick, as he even started working on his music again. He co-wrote a song called "Get Up and Dance" and recorded the track. He released it on his own label, Mood Records, and the song went #1 in the local area. However, Rick now had a new problem. The distributor wouldn't pay him until he delivered a full album. Rick then decides to cut an entire album and sell it to a national label. Recording part of his album in a studio that had been built in a barn by the jazz fusion group Spiral Gyra, Rick went to work. The remainder of the album was cut at the record plant in New York. At one point, Steven Tyler, lead singer of the group Aerosmith, stuck his head into a recording session. After getting the okay from Rick to check out what he was doing, Tyler came in and he was blown away by You and I, calling it, quote-unquote, the bomb. He assured Rick that the song would be a hit. When the album was finished, Rick flew to LA to shop it, and he made up his mind to go with any label except for Motown. It had never worked out with them in the past, so he wanted no part of working with them now. The next day, after getting to town, Rick was headed to check in with a couple of potential buyers, and in the elevator, somebody recognized him. It was Jeffrey Bowen, a producer from Motown, who he had met back in Rick's Minor Bird days. And when Rick told him that he had a tape, Jeffrey said that he would love to hear it. Rick told him that this isn't Motown style. Besides that, other than the Commodores, nobody was hot at Motown right now. After Jeffrey promised to give Rick an answer by tomorrow, Rick reluctantly agreed. But the next morning, Rick heard good news. Berry Gordy loved the album. Now, next, Rick had to get his look together. One day, at a concert, Rick saw some dancers that had intriguing hairstyles. They had animal hair woven into their natural braids, and this created long extensions, which were then turned into shapes. After the show, Rick went backstage to ask about the hairstyles, and he got to meet the woman who did them. She explained to Rick that the idea of the Maasai was to assume the power of the animals that was woven into their hair. When he heard that, Rick was hooked, and he made arrangements for that woman to come and put extensions, beads, braids, and weave the wild animal hair into his hair. Afterwards, Rick believed that he looked and he also felt like a Maasai warrior. His first single, You and I, was released in March of 1978. It went #1 on the R&B charts while hitting number 13 on the pop charts. His full album, titled Come Get It, was released the next month, and the album went gold. Another single, Mary Jane, hit number 3 on the R&B charts. In short order, Rick was on national TV on American Bandstand. Royalties started coming in, and Rick was getting rich about a minute. He bought a mansion in Coldwater Canyon that made his mother cry when she saw it. Rick's next album, Bustin' Out of L7, was released in January of 1979. The album spawned the singles Bustin' Out, which went number 8 on the R&B charts, and High on Your Love Suite. On the wheels of Bustin' Out, Berry Gordy asked Rick to produce Diana Ross. Rick's ego was inflated knowing that Gordy entrusted her to him. He immediately wrote the song I'm a Sucker for Your Love, which was supposed to be a duet for he and Diana, and she loved it. Shortly after that, Gordy told Rick that he'd only be doing some of the tracks on Diana's album, but Rick was under the impression he'd be doing the whole thing. After he found this out, he dropped out of producing any songs for Ross. In truth, he wasn't worried about it because he'd already heard another singer on the label that he wanted to work with. And though she was white, she sounded black. Her name? Teena Marie. Rick met Teena one day when he heard a soaring female voice coming out of a room. Assuming it was a black woman, he was shocked to see a short white girl. When he talked to her, she told him that she was working on demos for Diana Ross and Thelma Houston. When he asked her what music she loved the most, she told him soul music. He then asked her to sing some for him, and she did Etta James's At Last and Aretha Franklin's Angel. To say that Rick was impressed was putting it mildly. Teena had been at Motown for some time, but the label, they didn't know what to do with her. Since she was white, they kept trying to make her do pop music. Rick believed he knew what it took to make her a star. As a result, he produced her debut album, Wild and Peaceful. He intentionally didn't put her on the cover of the album as he wanted her ethnicity to be a mystery. Additionally, he didn't want people to be prejudiced against her music by seeing her. Rick reasoned that he'd get fans to like her music first, and then once that happened, people wouldn't care what color she was. Rick released his next album in 1979, Fire It Up, in October. The album went platinum, hitting number 5 on the charts, while the single, Love Gun, peaked at number 13. Meanwhile, Rick had convinced his mother to move to LA and live with him. That is, until an earthquake hit, and in the middle of the night, thinking that the roof would collapse, they all ran out of the house into the street. Rick's mother looked at him and said, quote, "I love you, baby, but I'm out of here," unquote. Less than a day later, she had moved back to Buffalo. Feeling insecure without his mother, Rick decided to move to Buffalo too. He felt he was now big enough as an artist to live wherever he wanted. Getting back to Rick's career, he hired a new manager, Shep Gordon. He primarily hired Gordon for 2 reasons. First, like Rick, he was from Buffalo. Second, he managed big stars like Alice Cooper and Teddy Pendergrass. Teddy Pendergrass. Rick never liked Teddy. He felt like Pendergrass was too egotistical, which was funny coming from Rick. However, in Rick's mind, he was different from Teddy because he knew when he was being an ass, and he had people who would call him on it. With Teddy, however, nobody could tell him anything. There was also another artist about to enter Rick's life, and he didn't like this guy's attitude either. Some dude named Prince. Promoters had been telling Rick that Prince wanted to open for him. They also said that Prince's music was heavily influenced by Rick's. After checking out a video of Prince performing, Rick was reminded of himself, and he also liked the song I Want to Be Your Lover. So he agreed to let Prince be his opening act. The two of them would have issues from the very start. Rick was put off by the fact that Prince never even introduced himself to Rick, especially since Rick was the one giving him a shot at being a star. Next, after about a week, Rick got word that Prince was stealing some of Rick's trademark on-stage moves. Rick watched Prince's show to see for himself. Sure enough, he was doing Rick's moves. Since Prince always went on first, to the crowd it would look like Rick was copying Prince's act, not the other way around. To resolve their issues, Rick called the meeting and straight out accused Prince of stealing his act. Prince denied it. Furthermore, he told Rick that Rick himself had gotten those same moves from, among others, James Brown and Jackie Wilson. Rick acknowledged that. Prince promised to cut back on doing moves similar to Rick's. On February the 1st, 1980, at Rick's birthday party, he got a small bit of revenge on Prince, as Prince and his crew crashed Rick's party. As payback, Rick went over to Prince's table, grabbed him by the back of his hair, and poured cognac down his throat. Prince immediately spat it out and, according to Rick, started crying like a baby, while Rick laughed at him. Rick plainly didn't like this Prince dude. His next album, Garden of Love, was released in 1980. The album peaked at number 17, while the single Big Time also hit number 17. The album didn't do as well as expected, and even Rick's mother speculated that the album was different because of Rick's previous success. In other words, his living the good life had disconnected his music sensibility from the streets. To try and reconnect, Rick began disguising himself and going incognito alone in his old neighborhoods in Buffalo. He absorbed the sounds and smells and just the overall scenes of everyday life. And he then decided he needed to isolate himself for his next project. To that end, he went to Sausalito, California, which is where the core of the album Street Songs was written. Of particular note was the song Fire and Desire. Rick wrote it as a duet, with he and Teena Marie performing it. When it came time to record the song, Teena was really sick and she couldn't sing. After examining her, a doctor said that Teena could be out for a week or so. Rick, not wanting to wait, found a local singer he thought could handle the job. Somehow, though, word of him doing that had gotten back to Teena. She got up out of her sick bed, showed up at the studio. Her explanation to Rick was this, quote, "No way I'm gonna let some other bitch sing that song," unquote. When Rick asked her if she could handle it despite being sick, she told him, quote, "Just play the track, Rick, and give me the headphones," unquote. Covered in sweat because of her fever, Teena stepped into the booth, and even Rick had to admit that she tore it up. The result was an iconic song that people still feel nearly 50 years later. Street Songs was released in April of 1981 and was a smash. It went number 1 on R&B and number 3 pop, while also going quadruple platinum. The single Give It To Me Baby went number 1 R&B, while Super Freak went number 3. While he wasn't aware of it at the time, Rick had reached the height of his success. From this point, he would begin declining in both his personal life and his career. For a time, Rick was pursuing Janice Gaye. Janice was married to Marvin Gaye at the time, but he was neglecting her and their marriage was on the rocks. Rick would later admit that he was competitive with Marvin, who was the old Prince of Motown. Rick saw himself as the new Prince, and Rick saw their struggles as a chance for him to move in on Janice. At one point, he even hired her to work in his office. However, he later admitted to primarily having used her to deliver and pick up his vices. Meanwhile, he and Teena Marie had also started messing around. When he refused to be in an exclusive relationship with her, she got angry. A little later, he began a relationship with actress Linda Blair, who was most famous for her role in the movie The Exorcist. It started when he saw in the magazine article that Linda said that she thought Rick was the sexiest man in the world. Shortly after that, they met in New York and discovered that they were kindred spirits. Their love affair burned hot, at least until it burned out. Here's another incident with Prince. At an after-party for a music awards show, Rick was there with his mother, and she was getting autographs from all the stars there. When Rick met back up with her, she told him that she'd seen Prince. Rick said, "You didn't ask him for his autograph, did you?" "I sure did," his mama responded. "Why?" "Because I like his music, son. I think it's great." "Okay, so now you have Prince's autograph." "Wish I did. When I asked him, he just turned around and walked away." Oh no, Rick was heated now. Hearing this, he immediately went looking for Prince. When he found him, Rick says he was going to lay him out until Prince's manager intervened. After Rick explained why he was mad, Prince said he didn't know it was Rick's mother. Again, Prince's manager stepped in. Quote, "Prince will be happy to apologize to your mother, and he will be happy to apologize to you," the manager said. Prince then proceeded to do just that. Musically, Rick's next project would be to produce a song for the Temptations. With the group reuniting with lead singers David Ruffin, Eddie Kendricks, and Dennis Edwards, Rick produced the single Standing on the Top. The song was the biggest Temptations hit in years as it went number 6. Rick also decided he wanted to create a girl group. Before he did, though, for an unknown reason, he talked to Prince's manager about his concept for the group. Not long after that, Prince came out with his own girl group, Vanity 6. Despite being beat to the punch by his rival, Rick pressed forward with his plans. Initially wanting to name the group the Colored Girls, he got talked out of that by his mother, and she gave him a better name to use, Mary Jane Girls. In 1982, Rick released the album Throwing Down, which went gold, and included the hit Dance With Me, Part 1. The next year saw him release Cold Blooded. The album went #1 on the charts while also going gold. It spawned You Bring the Freak Out as well as the duet Ebony Eyes with Smokey Robinson. However, the biggest hit was the single Cold Blooded. Rick later reflected that he wrote the song about his affair with Linda Blair and how she could freeze his blood. He also speculated that the title could have referred to Linda choosing to terminate a pregnancy without talking to him about it. On April 1st, 1984, Rick learned from Janice that Marvin Gaye's life had been taken by his father. Knowing that Marvin had been using, his passing had an impact on Rick's life, as he swore he would never touch any dope again. His oath lasted exactly one full day. Rick had been found unresponsive due to his abuse several different times, but he was able to keep it a secret from the media. This time it happened in Buffalo. After being rushed to the hospital, he was told he needed to stay there for several weeks. During all of his incidents, the main thought in Rick's head was not wanting his mother to know what happened to him. This time, after he was in the hospital for 2 days, his mother showed up. Rick, who was already tired of being there, was getting dressed to leave. His mother tried to convince him to stay, but Rick had his mind made up. In one last effort to convince him, she told Rick that he'd have to push her out of the way to leave that hospital. Rick pushed his mother out of the way and she fell to the floor. Realizing what he'd done, he reached down to help her up, but his mother wanted no part of it. She told Rick to get out of her sight, and she also told him that she prayed that one day he'd stop serving Satan, start serving God. Rick heard what she said, then he went out, got his vice, and he used it to go out of his mind for the next 2 days straight. After this, wanting to kick his habit, he decided he needed to talk to someone that had once been in his shoes, but was now cured. He settled on Ray Charles. Rick met with Ray. While Ray's vice had been H and not cocaine, he still related to Rick's problem. First, he told Rick he kicked his habit to avoid going to jail. He also told him that he had his biggest hits when he was high, and that it would have been easier to quit if it had ruined his career. Finally, he told Rick that if he was a fool like him, he could work while he was loaded, and it was going to be hard to give it up. In other words, Rick being able to do that was not a blessing. Next, Rick would have another situation with Prince. Sort of. Eddie Murphy, looking to develop a career outside of comedy, wanted to sing. Eddie initially asked Rick to produce him. However, in the drug-induced haze, Rick never responded. Eddie tried to get Prince to produce him, but then he pivoted back to Rick. And he told Rick how much he loved to work with him. Rick countered, what happened to Prince? Eddie told him that Prince made him uncomfortable and that he didn't like how Prince would just sit there and look at him. You know this was music to Rick's ears. He made it a point to make sure he got a hit for Eddie, if only to shove it in Prince's face. The resulting song, Party All the Time, wasn't only a hit, the video for the song helped Rick to finally get a video on MTV. Meanwhile, Rick's substance abuse issues were taking over his life. He became extremely depressed and he was again considering taking his own life. One day when he was in Manhattan, he got so messed up that he blacked out. When he woke up, he was lying in the street and a woman was looking down at him. She helped him up and took him to her place and let him sleep it off. When he woke up, she fed him and asked him what else she could do to help him. She didn't ask for money, nor did she want to start a relationship with him, as nothing sexual happened between them. The woman was content with simply doing a good deed. Rick kissed her on the cheek, told her that God was good, and left. Rick later credited her with having saved his life. When he got back to his hotel, his mother was waiting in the lobby, and he hugged her for a long time, breaking down in tears. She'd come to spend Christmas with him so he wouldn't be alone. They both would spend Christmas for a few hours at Eddie Murphy's house, then later for a while at Diana Ross's place. At Diana's, he met Catherine Oxenberg, who at the time was appearing on the TV show Dynasty. Her mother was Princess Elizabeth of Yugoslavia. The princess and Rick became friends. These recent events all helped Rick to come out of his depression, and he stopped using. He even broke things off with the princess, as he felt that she was too good for a loser like him. Then he started using again. Despite all of the people in his life, his family, Debbie Allen, Jim Brown, Princess Elizabeth, Teena Marie, and even Eddie Murphy, who told him that he was slowly taking his own life, he didn't listen. However, when his attorneys and his accountants came to his house and told him they would resign if he didn't go to rehab, listen. He went to McLean Hospital outside of Boston, which was where Ray Charles had gone to get clean. Rick didn't like being there, But things got easier when he found out that his old friend Steven Tyler was there too. Tyler looked healthy and he gave Rick hope that rehab might work. Ultimately, Rick made it through the program, and he now focused on his next album, Glow. Meanwhile, he was serious about staying sober. He got so sober when he got to see Janice Gay again, he could see that she was still using. Rick told her that unless she cleaned up her act, he never wanted to see her or talk to her again. She thought he was kidding, but he was serious. He was able to maintain that for about 6 months. Ironically, at a sobriety party that Carrie Fisher threw for him, he relapsed. That meant another bout of rehab at McLean and another chance to hang out with Steven Tyler, who'd also relapsed. Afterwards, Rick was clean again, but another situation would help scare him straight. He couldn't sing. When he went to see a doctor, they told him that if he used Rocaine again, he'd permanently lose his singing voice. Rick was so scared he even threw away his cigarettes. As usual, the sobriety didn't last. Meanwhile, Rick was fighting with Motown over the promotion of his music. Besides that, he was fighting with the label over his group, the Mary Jane Girls. As a result, they each started suing each other in lawsuits that would last for years. While the court cases raged on, this helped Rick fall back into substance abuse. Around this same time, he met Tanya Hijazi, who was the same age as Rick's daughter. He tried to avoid falling in love with her, and to that end, he pushed her away. Meanwhile, he was still in court with Motown. To cover his legal bills, he had to sell his Rolls Royce and his Excalibur. Even after that, he was so broke he started having to rely on women to take care of him. Finally, his lawsuit against Motown was over, and they paid him a large settlement. Next, he had to find a new label to call home, and he settled on Warner Brothers, which was home to his rival Prince. Rick only agreed to sign after they assured him that they wouldn't pay more attention to Prince than they did to him. They also agreed to pay him $850,000 per album. Then something happened to Rick that nobody expected. He found religion. Through a girlfriend, he began talking to the girl's mother, who began talking to Rick about God. She told him all about God's love and how even the worst things you'd ever done would be forgiven by him. Rick listened and he began trying to be as Christ-like as he could. He read the Bible in its entirety and at one point started speaking in tongues. He also changed the content of his music. The words to new songs came easy, as his songs now spoke about glorifying God. He was inspired to bring God into other people's lives. When Rick signed with Warner Brothers, he was assigned Benny Medina as his A&R man. While Rick was elated with his life changes, Medina was not. After flying to Buffalo to hear Rick's newest album, which was all about religion and God, Medina told him he'd need time to think about what he'd heard. A couple of weeks later, Medina called him. He told Rick that Warner didn't want that album, as it was not a quote-unquote Rick James album. When Rick argued that it was an album from a Rick James who was on fire for the Lord, Medina shot back that that wasn't the Rick James that the label signed. When Rick said that it was the album that God wanted him to make, Medina retorted, quote-unquote, God isn't paying you, we are. He went on to tell Rick that he wasn't signed as a gospel artist, but as a secular artist. If he didn't deliver a secular album, he'd be going through legal wars all over again. Of course, Rick had just gotten out of that extended legal battle with Motown, and he didn't want to go through that again. Besides, he was counting on that money to live off of. After considering what the Bible said about losing your soul for profit, Rick gave in to what the label wanted. In his words, he later reflected that he wanted the money more than he wanted the integrity. To that end, he rewrote the lyrics and changed all the tracks. Oh yeah, he also started using it again. The resulting album, Wonderful, was released in 1988. It contained the #1 song, Lucy's Rap. Rick did one more album for Warner Brothers that was never released. However, he would get renewed fame as well as an influx of cash from an unexpected source. Rapper MC Hammer released the song You Can't Touch This in 1990. The song sampled Rick's song Super Freak heavily, and Hammer didn't get James's permission to use the song. As a result, Rick had to sue him, and he won his case. Meanwhile, Rick was still struggling with substance abuse and sunk to one of the lowest levels of his life. Around this time, the girl that he initially tried to resist, Tanya, came back into his life. However, instead of her lifting him up, Rick brought her down to his level. She began joining him in his vices and addiction. Rick was admittedly foggy on what happened next, does remember, though, that all of a sudden there was another woman there who Rick thought was the lady of the evening. Her name was Frances Alley, and she stayed with he and Tanya for about a week before going back to her pimp. According to Rick, the pimp was angry that Frances had come back with no money, and he physically assaulted her and hurt her with a pipe. Frances then returned to Rick's place in bad shape. Seeing her condition, Tanya drove her to the ER. That night, over 24 cops broke down Rick's door and held weapons to his head. Frances had told authorities that Rick and Tanya were the ones that hurt her. Rick was arrested and charged with assault, and his bail was placed at $1 million. He was able to post bail after about a week, just in time to visit his dying mother. When Rick got out to see her, she was unable to speak, but her eyes recognized him. She began to cry before she drifted into unconsciousness. Rick also began to cry, and he left the room. Minutes later, he found out that his mother had passed. After her funeral, Rick had to focus on his court case. However, before he could resolve one case, he found himself in the middle of another one. One day, Rick had a large supply of quack delivered to him. Meanwhile, he invited Mary Sauger, a music executive, to he and Tanya's hotel room. He had the idea that Mary would help him to start his own record label. However, at one point, she began arguing with Rick and Tanya. According to Rick, Mary kicked Tanya in the stomach and then took a swing at Rick. In response, Rick punched her, then proceeded to physically assault her. According to Rick, after this occurred, he offered Mary some quack, and for the next 2 days they indulged. Mary then left the suite without further incident. After an uncertain amount of time had passed, hours, days, Rick wasn't sure, Mary tried to shake him down. She wanted $2,000 in cash and a shopping spree in Beverly Hills. Rick blew her off, despite her threat to bring assault charges against him. He found out the next day that she wasn't bluffing, as newscasts everywhere talked about he and Tanya allegedly assaulting Mary. Ultimately, Rick was charged with assault and kidnapping, and he was given 5 years in prison. With good behavior, though, he could be out in 2 years. Despite that, Rick wasn't really doing hard time. One female corrections officer got him an acoustic guitar. She also got him a tape recorder. Additionally, he drank all the champagne and ate all the escargot steak that he wanted. Rick was paroled from prison in August of 1996 after having served a little more than 2 years. After Tanya was released from jail, they got married in December 1997. Also in 1997, Rick put out the final album he would release in his lifetime, Urban Rhapsody. Ever since Rick was released from prison, his health had been steadily deteriorating. He suffered a mild stroke in 1998. He also began wearing a pacemaker. Though he was no longer releasing chart-topping albums, fame wasn't through with Rick James just yet. An unexpected surge in popularity would come from an unexpected source. In early 2004, the TV show Chappelle Show featured a comedy sketch in a segment called Charlie Murphy's True Hollywood Stories. The sketch featured Dave Chappelle portraying Rick James, with Eddie Murphy's brother Charlie narrating the action. The sketch consisted of Murphy recounting several outrageous situations he'd been involved in with Rick James back in the 1980s, at the height of Rick's popularity. This is where the catchphrase "I'm Rick James, bitch" originated. To top the sketch off, Rick himself appeared several times, addressing his behavior in the sketch. Occasionally, Rick would offer no explanation and would simply say, "Cocaine is a hell of a drug." The sketch was wildly popular and had people across the country uttering the catchphrase whenever possible. Rick rode the wave of his newfound popularity. In May of that year, he went on one final tour with Teena Marie. The next month, in his final public appearance, he and Teena performed their hit Fire and Desire at the BET Music Awards. He even got to utter his catchphrase one final time, to the delight of the crowd. On the morning of August 6, 2004, Rick was found lifeless in his home. He passed because of both cardiac and pulmonary failure. He was only 56 years old. With Rick's passing, the world lost a one-of-a-kind original. His blend of R&B, funk, and rock music came at a time when R&B needed him most. He was also a successful producer, and his greatness helped put Motown back on the map as a power label in the world of music. While songs like Mary Jane, Super Freak, and Give It To Me Baby tended to reflect and focus on the excesses of his life, unfortunately his private life didn't reflect the success of his career. Rick seemingly was always battling something during his entire life. The military, the law, record labels, or addiction. Sadly, his battle with himself was the one that proved to be the one that he fought the longest and with the least success. What's your favorite Rick James song? Let us know in the comments. Thank you all for checking out our video. We appreciate you spending time with us. We have other videos that need love too. Take time to check those out as well. Thanks again and see you soon.